Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. SEER is a member organization whose mission is to foster the success of a diverse community of environmental, energy, and resources lawyers, advisors, law students, and decision makers, and provide a premier forum for the exchange of ideas and information.
Yate everyone, Heather Tanana Yinishe. My name is Heather Tanana, and I am a research professor at the University of Utah's College of Law. And I'm thrilled to be here today with my colleague, John.
Hi, and I'm John Ruple. I'm a law professor here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. And I work with the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment here with Professor Tanana. So I'm excited to have this conversation today, Heather. I'm really enjoyed working with you on your our recent article, Synching Science and Policy to Address Climate Change in Tribal Communities, which the ABA published in its Natural Resources and Environment Journal. I think before we begin, I'd like to thank Rob DeAndrea, who assisted us with research on the paper, and also thank the ABA for their attention to environmental justice. Our paper talks about cross-cultural communication to address climate change and specifically about syncing science and policy in tribal communities. Heather, why is this such an important topic generally, and how is climate change impacting tribal communities?
Yeah, so I think a lot of us have seen the recent rise in attention to climate change, and certainly we're all experiencing it, right? Here out in the West, big New York Times headline today that the Great Salt Lake is at its lowest levels ever. And we're experiencing that in a lot of our different water systems. People who are on the coast are experiencing floodings, and tribal communities are some of the communities that are most impacted and referred to as frontline communities. They're experiencing climate change directly and some at a disproportionate rate. And again, just depending on where they live, it might be different. Like in the West, the droughts are really affecting our Southwest tribes, but on the coast, those tribes are experiencing too much water, right? The flooding is really risking the livelihood of these communities and forcing many of them to consider relocation. So it's a really important topic generally for all Americans, everyone across the world to be aware of, but particularly so for many of our tribes today.
I know that every tribe is different, and as our friend Daryl Vigil would say, to know one tribe is to know one tribe. But are there common themes in how tribes and tribal members understand climate change and the science of climate change?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's such a great quote by Daryl. So those who don't know, we have 574 federally recognized tribes across the United States, both in the lower 48 and then, several up in Alaska. And while all of these tribes are distinct tribal nations, they have experienced many similarities in terms of federal policies, removal from their ancestral lands, and some of the work that we've been doing here has focused on past federal policies and how it has left tribes in more vulnerable positions with respect to climate change. So, for example, a lot of effort was directed by the federal government to build up infrastructure across the country. Tribes were left out of that. And so we have many tribal communities that don't have access to clean and safe water, or the systems that they do have in place are outdated. They can't withstand the demands of increasing population or climate change. And so when we're looking at tribal communities and trying to understand climate change impacts and address those challenges, we have to acknowledge how we got here in the first place. And that involves looking at the past policies. And then second, really acknowledging the value that tribes can bring to the table. And so, you mentioned science of climate change, and we can talk about this more later, right? But there is a growing movement to recognize tribal ecological knowledge, indigenous science, and each of the tribes across the United States, right? They're going to have their own specialized knowledge and experiences, lived experiences that is unique to their community, and that can play a role in how we address climate change.
Heather, before we go too much further, I'd like to step back a little bit and talk about some fundamental concepts in Indian law. We're recording this podcast from Utah, where the designation, reduction, and reinstatement of Bears Ears National Monument has been pretty controversial. The monument was originally designated in response to a request by 5 tribal nations that sought to protect a culturally important landscape. And how to manage a federally owned landscape that is part of the ancestral domain of 5 different tribes and is outside of an Indian reservation has been a topic of intense debate. Some of that debate involves who can and who should speak on behalf of Native Americans who claim cultural ties to the landscape. And that debate has been particularly intense, I think, with respect to the Navajo Nation. Some emphasize the importance of members of the nation who reside here in Utah, close to the monument. Others turn to the opinions of tribal government officials who often work and live farther away at the tribal headquarters in Window Rock, Arizona. Can you help us clear up some of the confusion? Who speaks on behalf of Native Americans and Native American governments?
Yeah, so that's a really good and important question, because a lot of times people who don't or aren't very familiar with tribes or this kind of past history of Native Americans in the US may consider them just another racial group, along with Latinx or Black American communities. But Native Americans in this country are designated as a political status. And so, like your local government, state government, federal government, tribal members, we vote for and elect our tribal leaders today. And so there are tribal representatives that are advocating passing laws for their community and representing their community on a government to government level with state, local, federal governments. But then there are also the tribal members who are just community members from that area. And so I think with respect to who speaks on Native Americans, that's pretty safe to make a parallel to other forms of government, and whether you think your elected official speaks on behalf of you, right? Certainly here in Utah, participated in the elections, and sometimes the person I agree with their viewpoints, they win, and sometimes they don't. So we will naturally have disagreements and whether an elected official truly represents the voice of every single member. But when we're looking to these negotiations that occur between governments, it is the tribal leaders that are representing their tribe and able to speak on behalf of their tribe. And tribal members that have differing opinions, well, they'll have to show up at the next tribal election.
That answers a great segue into the concept of tribal sovereignty. Can you talk a little bit about what tribal sovereignty is and why it's such an important concept? Is sovereignty something that was granted to tribes by the federal government, or an inherent right reserved to the tribes? And why is that distinction so important?
Yeah, it is an inherent recognized authority and power that tribes have. And one, we mention it briefly in our article, the Marshall Trilogy, that really was the first 3 series of cases in the US Supreme Court to set forth the relationship of tribes with respect to the federal and state governments, and recognize that tribes have sovereign inherent authority to govern their people and their lands. And it's that power that enables tribes to enact their tribal codes, that enables them to engage with local, state, federal governments on a government to government relationship. And so it's really important. But it's also changed a little over the years. Those Marshall trilogies, at the same time recognizing inherent sovereign authority of tribes, they also referred to tribes as dependent domestic nations as well. And so there's this balance of they have inherent sovereign powers, but they're not entirely absolute anymore, which, I guess makes sense, right? Navajo Nation can't go and declare war on another country. As a Dene Navajo citizen, I'm also a US citizen. And so there are some limitations on that power that have been affected by case law and statutory powers. But the big takeaway, and the one I hope our audience comes away with, is that tribes, they are still sovereign nations today. They have the power and authority to regulate their people and their lands, to protect their communities and ensure their survival into the future.
That's really helpful. But what are the kinds of legal obligations the federal government owes to tribes and to individual tribal members? And where do those obligations arise from?
Yeah, I mean, and that's key, right? Because even though tribes are inherent sovereigns, the federal government still has responsibilities to tribes. And those stem from treaties. They come from the trust responsibility, and sometimes they can also come from specific statutes. But really, again, going back to kind of the Marshall trilogy and early case law, when the federal government moved tribes westward, took their land, right? A lot of times they entered into treaties, a lot of times, not always, but there was this promise by the federal government to protect tribes, to enable their prosperity, that the reservations established for them would be permanent homelands. And so in order to fulfill those responsibilities, there's certain obligations that the government has. And we see it in different areas, and we also see it in our environmental world, that the government has a trust responsibility to protect the resources of tribes and, again, promote this kind of community health. It's part of the reason Indian Health Services was established, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Each of these federal agencies, play a role in really protecting the resources and important community values of the tribe going forward.
That makes a lot of sense when we're talking about the federal government, because obviously they were the party that signed treaties with tribal nations. But states and local governments don't necessarily have that relationship. They weren't entering into treaties with Native nations. But today, we still see state and local governments that need to work and collaborate with tribal governments to address common challenges, whether it's climate change or any of a host of other issues. What are the opportunities here for states and tribes to collaborate? And are certain practices that are helpful in contributing to that kind of success?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're right, state and local governments, they don't have an underlying legal responsibility to tribes. But some of the greatest successes we've seen in, whether it's resource management, ensuring the success of infrastructure projects, right? It's been when people come together and collaborate. And a lot of states are starting to establish their own tribal consultation policies. I think it's also a growing recognition of the jurisdictional challenges that reservations today, many of them, what we refer to as checkerboarded. So you'll have different types of land within the reservation boundaries. More than 50% of Native Americans today live off the reservation. And so each state is going to have a urban Native American population that they would be responsible for. It's the same of any of their other state citizens providing services for. And so it's important to not overlook state and local government, I think, with tribal affairs. And we've seen some movements in the criminal realm with cross-jurisdiction agreements, and those carry over into child welfare as well. The state of Utah, our Division of Child Family Services, has agreements with each of our 8 tribes. In some areas, we're also seeing it in environmental as well, with kind of more collaboration, collaborative management. But I think it really all begins with, do you have a consultation policy in place so that you can begin establishing those relationships and identifying the opportunities for collaboration? And so the states that don't have them established yet, really encourage them to look at the other states that have. Colorado has one. Utah, we had a Senate bill proposed that set forth a consultation policy really directed at child welfare, but could be more broadly used as well.
That's really helpful. And you used the term jurisdiction in there. I want to pick up on that a little bit. Some of our earlier work dealt with jurisdictional issues here in Eastern Utah, specifically the extent of what constitutes Indian country and what that meant for certain kinds of environmental regulation. Can you help us understand what's the difference between an Indian reservation and Indian country, and why is that an important distinction?
Yeah, jurisdiction is so key, right? Because that's where we start from to determine who has the power and authority to act. Is it the state? Is it the federal government? Is it the tribe? Or is it multiple parties? And for the definition of Indian country, we pulled that actually from the criminal code, and it's kind of, for the most part, generally been applied civilly as well. 18 USC 1511, and it includes all lands within Indian reservations, as well as all dependent Indian communities and all Indian allotments. And so usually when we're looking at tribal lands, a lot of times it tends to be the reservation. And so I think that's why people, when they think of Indian country, rather than using that broader term, they'll just refer to the Indian reservation. But an Indian reservation is a subset of Indian country. And that's always our first inquiry, right? When we're looking at an issue, certainly in the legal world, who has jurisdiction? Well, we have to determine what type of land is involved. And if it's Indian country, well, that's when the tribe most likely will have jurisdiction. And fascinating development of cases over time, right? At the beginning with Marshall Trilogy, tribal authority was very strong over, if you're talking about an Indian country, their lands is absolute. We've again kind of seen that diminished a little bit over time, particularly in our criminal jurisdiction world, but you always begin with where are you at? If it's Indian country, then we need to look at the tribe.
It seems to me like such an important distinction, just recognizing that jurisdiction may extend beyond the physical boundary of the reservation itself. It could include non-native owned land within the exterior boundary of a reservation. So it really seems important to understand that jurisdictional component at the outset of these kinds of discussions. But getting back to our paper, we talked a lot about the meaning of science, what that term means to different audiences, and how various consumers treat scientific information. For example, to a scientist, science is more about process than product. It's iterative effort to acquire and refine knowledge, and that process necessarily looks to areas of uncertainty. To public and many policymakers, that they're often interested or less interested in a journey of discovery than in a clear black and white answer. When should somebody get vaccinated? When should they start or stop wearing masks? What's the correct contaminant level for setting things like the National Ambient Air Quality Standards or National Drinking Water Standards? To many of us, that kind of uncertainty that is central to the scientific process is a problem rather than an opportunity for future research. And of course, legal disputes arise and often involve these kinds of technical or scientific questions. One party may argue to defer action until more information becomes available. So what does science mean in Indigenous communities, and how is that similar or different from the ways others might see and understand the term science?
Yeah, generally, I think that Indigenous communities, they really take a more holistic view of looking at the community as a whole, not separating out maybe like an individual impacts from community level or broader environment, really valuing lived experiences and the knowledge that people gain from their lived experience, and looking also, I think, at a longer time frame period as well. So how impacts today relate to events that happened in the past and how they will affect the future. And that just goes, I think, again, every tribe is different, but many tribes value balance. And in Navajo, we talk about hojo, that when you have hojo, it's when things are in balance with one another. And if you get out of balance, then that your health will go down. That's not good. We have to restore balance. And that applies to all ways of life and all aspects. And so that's really the big difference, I think, or is the value placed on experiences. And it doesn't have to be published in a peer review article to be considered science and important knowledge for the future. And that when we're looking at an issue or a topic area, that we want to take a broader viewpoint and make sure that we're not too narrowed in. Kind of going back to really our challenges with communications. Are we looking at the tree or taking in the forest viewpoint? And I think just the many tribal ways of life, we're looking at the whole forest and beyond.
Heather, that's a great explanation. I think this is a really important topic, so I want to dig a little deeper. Can you talk a little more about traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge? What exactly is it? Some contend that Indigenous knowledge is a form of scientific knowledge. What's your take? And how, as a non-native, can we better understand those questions of traditional ecological knowledge?
Yeah, and that's important, right? Like we've talked about previously, I mentioned, this growing recognition and of traditional ecological knowledge. And there's a lot of terms that get thrown out there. You hear traditional ecological knowledge, TK, just ecological knowledge, and then more recently, the term Indigenous science. And it was actually a couple years ago talking with someone from the Karuk tribe that they really were the ones who impressed on me that this traditional knowledge, it is Indigenous science. It's not, the value of it is not any different than Western Americanized science, and that we really should start utilizing that term Indigenous science to emphasize that it's just as valid, just as important to use when we're confronting environmental challenges like climate change. And again, it comes back to the fact that Indigenous peoples here in the United States have been here on this land since time immemorial. And so they have a lot of knowledge about the land in their different regions. They've experienced, changes to the land over that time period and have learned a lot and have a lot to contribute when we're talking about whether it's resource management, protecting the environment. There's real value and it shouldn't be overlooked, especially now when climate change impacts are increasing and we have to take action. The Indigenous science should be part of our responses.
So how can Indigenous science improve what non-natives like myself normally think of as scientific information? And how should indigenous knowledge inform decision-making?
Yeah, I think it follows off the assertion that there are unique viewpoints, there's unique information that mainstream science won't pick up on that tribal communities have. And so I think it's really important to engage with tribal communities, to consult with them, to see, one, where interests overlie, because many tribal communities, because the land, the environment, water is often incorporated into different traditions and has real meaningful spiritual, cultural value. Many tribal communities are very protective of the environment. And so there's a lot of opportunity to work together with tribal communities, not just in the broader goal of protecting environmental values or resources, but also with, going back to recognizing this historic role they played in managing the land for so many years and taking the opportunity to learn from them. Because a lot of times I think, and this is evident if you look at the past federal Indian policies over the last several decades, it's easy to look at an issue and to come up with what you think might be the right solution. But then that solution ends up causing actually more harm, right? This is the classic example of boarding schools. Let's educate Native children. I think we can all agree with that, but the way that they went about it was more harmful to those children, and many of those children never returned home. And so yes, that's talking about education, child removal, but that same principle, I think, can be much more broadly applied, that when we're looking at an issue and we're thinking of solutions, maybe let's pause, let's engage certainly with the community that's actually being impacted by that issue, and listen and learn from them and what they have to contribute, and to come up with likely a much better solution in the long term.
Communication seems to be a central concept in this discussion, and something that's really critical to having successful relationships. And we've talked a bit about how some see science as a process, while others see science as a product. And we've also talked about how some lean into concepts like scientific uncertainty, while others will recoil from that. And then we're also incorporating traditional or indigenous science. And with science having so many different meanings and understandings to different people and different audiences, what are your thoughts on how we can facilitate effective communication and common understandings? Are there best practices that we should be considering when communicating across cultures?
Yeah, and I think that's, and we saw this in some of the different literature that we reviewed, I think is also applicable more broadly about communication, is highlighting the value of storytelling and narratives. Because communication, it's so important. And we've seen over the last few years how misinformation can be spread by some really good communication, right? And so it's a powerful tool to utilize if you're doing it correctly, to be able to reach a wide range of audience across the United States, different backgrounds and all sorts of things. And a lot of what our paper really highlights is that using simple narratives can reach a wide range of audience, and that use of narratives, use of storytelling, that also really resonates with tribal communities, because it's how our stories, our traditional knowledge is passed down through storytelling and these oral histories. And so that's not to discredit the written forms of communications, a lot of value in getting that out, but I think people using their voices, sharing their experiences can be extremely powerful.
Heather, that's great. And that's really, really useful, really insightful. I'm wondering, are there some tools that can be used to enhance scientific communication, cross-cultural communication? And are the same tools that might be useful in scientific communication equally useful in cross-cultural communication?
Yeah, and I think, the key to that is really making information understandable and relatable. So, we have this challenge in the legal field as well. I think sometimes our writing can get so technical, a lot of legalese used, that unless you're an attorney, you can't understand what the point was. And sometimes the scientific journals may be the same way, right? You just have the long methods and the statistics, and people kind of just throw up their hands and be like, I can't really understand what that's saying, even though it's in English. And so it's an effort that not just scientists need to make, but other professions as well, like attorneys. How can we share our knowledge? How can we communicate to people who are not in our field? Because a lot of times those are the individuals that we need to become involved in these issues, to use their vote and make change on the ground. And so that number one tip is really, write in a way that people can understand. We don't need to impress anyone with, crazy SAT words. Just let's make it understandable and straight to the point. And then also to the extent that you can make it relatable, which for me is really the why should I care? Why should your audience care about this issue? So connecting it to your target audience so they can understand what you're writing and come away feeling like, oh, this impacts me. I should care about it. I should do something about it. And that, I think, applies to all communities. And so, if you're working, maybe targeting a specific tribal community on an issue they're facing, right? Take some time to understand that community. What are their concerns? We do have this challenge as well with language barriers sometimes, that some of our tribal elders may speak their tribal language only and not English, right? So do we need to translate? That may be an issue, but broadly, if you make it understandable and relatable, I think you're on the right track.
Thanks for that insight, Heather. I think that's really helpful. Before we wrap up, I'd like to step back a bit and talk about trust. There are many reasons that Native Americans may distrust non-natives, and those reasons are deeply rooted in our history. What can non-natives do to build trust and facilitate productive relationships with Native Americans and with tribal governments?
Yeah, and really, I think the first step is taking the time to educate yourself. Here in the United States, we really don't get a good understanding of Native American history in school. And there was actually a little poll done not too long ago, just a couple years ago, where half of the respondents weren't even aware that Native Americans and tribes still existed today. And so there's a lot of just basic education that needs to go on. And there's a lot of resources out there. If you were to Google around, some great books, some great podcasts, including this one, but this land podcast, I think they also do an excellent job of going through the history, the past federal policies that have resulted in conditions today. And so that's the first step, right? Understand, how did we get to a world where 40% of Navajo Nation homes don't have water coming into their homes? How did we get to, the situation where many tribes are having to seriously consider relocating their entire communities because it may not be around anymore due to flooding? So that's that first step is, take some time to educate yourself, and then engaging with community partners, just really being committed to listening to that, whoever it is, the community members, the tribal leaders, listen to them to hear what their priorities are, and show that you're committed for being a long-term partner. I think a lot of times in Indian country, we see people from outside of the community coming in, and they'll just stay for a year at most, and then they're gone again. And so that can be a real challenge to building meaningful, lasting relationships. But if you take the time to educate yourself on the issues, to reach out, meet with people, establish those connections, and show them that that relationship is important to you, and that you're there to be a partner for the long haul and not just for the next 6 months, you'll probably have greater success.
Listening is critical. And I guess I'm wondering, are there specific questions that lawyers and policymakers should consider when communicating about issues like climate change, either inside or outside of Native communities?
Yeah, well, I think that's, like building off of what we were just talking to, of the importance of building trust first. And so lawyers, when they're coming into a community, thinking about how can I establish my credibility with this community? How can I build trust with them? There are a lot of legal needs out in tribal communities. Native Americans represent a very small proportion of attorneys in the United States. So again, many services will have to be provided by non-tribal members. And so there's that need there. You could help fulfill that need, but you're going to be more successful and provide greater help if you establish that relationship first, and build trust and work with the community on setting their priorities and identifying their needs, I think.
That's really helpful. And Heather, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure working with you on this article and talking more today. I've learned a lot. Do you have any closing thoughts for us?
Yeah, I'm just happy to be here today. And I think the takeaway I want people to have is that this is a real opportunity right now and needed action to address climate change. We can't ignore climate change any longer. And there's a lot of science out there that supports climate change. So it's not a question anymore, is climate change real? It is, it's happening. It is already grounded in science. But to have the greatest success in the future, if we come together in partnership and collaborate and include all of the players, yes, the federal government has a role, the state government, local government has a role. We cannot ignore tribes. They have a lot to contribute beyond their Indigenous science. They have their own governing bodies and ability to enact their own laws. We need to utilize all of the resources that are available if we're going to see real change in the future.
Thanks to the ABA. It's been a pleasure to join you on this podcast.
Yay, thanks for having us. It was a pleasure to be here today.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at www.americanbar.org/enviro. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.